There are 9 critical voting rights lawsuits pending in North Carolina, a battleground state, according to the Biden campaign. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Mark Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started. North Carolina has some of the most active voting rights litigation in the country. Before we get into the specifics of the lawsuits, Mark, why is North Carolina such a litigious state?
Yeah, so first of all, as I mentioned, this is a battleground state, not just for the presidential elections. There is a key governor's race in that state. And people don't realize that North Carolina is really a 51-49 state. It has had a Democratic governor. It has a Republican gerrymandered legislature. It has traditionally voted for president for Republicans, but by only the narrowest of margins. And that state is changing demographically to become bluer and bluer. And because the legislature is so overwhelmingly Republican due to gerrymandering, you see a state that passes rigged maps in the redistricting arena, and of course passes voter suppression laws. Also, we have seen the state court system in that state evolve from one that was very balanced to now that one leans right. So that's why you're also seeing so many of these cases being brought in federal court.
So of these 9 lawsuits, 8 are trying to make it easier to vote, but there's one that's trying to make it harder to vote. Let's start with that anti-voting lawsuit.
Yeah, so no surprise for regular viewers and readers of Democracy Docket, but there is a voter purge lawsuit from Republicans who claim that, the state of North Carolina is not in compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. Basically, put another way, they want fewer people to be able to vote because, as regular viewers know, Republicans' plan for November is to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat. And this is part of making it harder to vote. This lawsuit was filed in 2021. It is set for trial not until 2025. This case has been going on a very long time. As I mentioned, this is one of a series of similar lawsuits that we have seen all over the country, in which Democracy Docket has covered in states like Nevada and Michigan and elsewhere. And if you are not already a subscriber to Democracy Docket, now is the time to become one, because we are heading towards the home stretch when these cases are going to make the difference between who can vote and who can't, and whether or not we will have continue to have a functioning democracy in November and afterwards. And I'm excited to say that Democracy Docket has an exclusive new offer, which is a 2-week trial premium membership. So click on the link above to get your 2-week free trial membership.
For the pro-voting lawsuits, there are 2 cases challenging the state's voter ID law. One is in state court, the other is in federal court. But they're both really interesting because they're challenging different aspects of the law.
Yeah, so this is actually very interesting. The state case is brought by the NAACP of North Carolina, which has a long history of challenging voter suppression laws in that state. And it is challenging a state constitutional amendment that was passed by lawmakers from racially gerrymandered districts. So in between the time a court struck down the state's districts and new districts were enacted, lawmakers put an amendment on the ballot requiring photo ID to vote. That amendment passed by voters. And the NAACP is basically saying, look, the authority of the state lawmakers to amend the state constitution when they were in those gerrymandered districts is suspect. The case made it up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. It was sent back down to the trial court. That case is ongoing. And it is still in discovery, so it'll be a while. The federal case, also brought by the North Carolina NAACP, challenges a law, Senate Bill 824, which requires voters to provide 1 of 10 authorized photo IDs to vote. This is similar to other photo ID laws that have been struck down in the past in North Carolina, including one struck down by the Fourth Circuit in 2016 for targeting Black voters with almost surgical precision. I think it is fair to say, Paige, that if they were targeting Black voters with near surgical precision 10 years ago, they have not gotten any less surgical or precise in the meantime. All of these cases can be found on the Democracy Docket website. There is a link in the show notes below to check out these cases and all of the content on Democracy Docket that we're talking about in these episodes.
There's also a lawsuit challenging one of the state's felony disenfranchisement laws, which imposes criminal penalties on someone if they vote while they're serving out a felony conviction, even if they mistakenly believe that they were eligible to vote. A trial court has struck down that law. They found it was intentionally discriminatory. The state has appealed that decision to the Fourth Circuit. But Mark, I want to right now talk about this other case, which is challenging the state's durational residency requirement when it comes to voter registration.
Yeah, this durational residency lawsuit is really, really interesting. We've seen a few of these around the country. In full disclosure, my law firm has brought this case in North Carolina and some of the others. And this goes back to enforcing a provision of the Voting Rights Act that frankly has not really seen much enforcement. The Voting Rights Act basically says you cannot require a voter to live in a state for a particular period of time in order to vote in that state. This was put into the Voting Rights Act as part of the 1970 amendments because there were lots of states that were trying to require people to live in a state for a period of time as a way of disenfranchising young voters, particularly voters who were either in college or were drafted into the military and were in states as part of their military service. So it was really targeted to protect young voters, but it's not limited only to the young voters. It's limited to all voters. And so a lawsuit was brought earlier this year by the North Carolina Alliance for Retired Americans, challenging North Carolina's 30-day residency requirement. Now, this doesn't say that you don't have to be a resident, but you can, let's say, Paige, you move from where you currently live to North Carolina, and like you give up your place here, and like you are living in North Carolina, you are making a home in North Carolina, you have a job in North Carolina, you go out and you get a driver's license in North Carolina, but let's say it's 29 days before the election. Well, you're no longer eligible to vote in your prior state because you have moved, you have re-domiciled yourself. But under North Carolina's law, it says you can't register there. So you're kind of like, you can't vote there, even though the registration deadline hasn't passed. So you're essentially, you can't vote anywhere. And so this federal law says that can't be the circumstance with respect to people voting in presidential elections. Lawsuit was brought. The sort of weird thing here is that the case got briefed pretty far along and then got transferred. The court transferred it to another judicial district. So we are waiting on that new judge to see what they rule. But this is definitely a case to follow.
There are also 3 lawsuits challenging SB 747. What's so special about this law, and why are there so many challenges to it?
So, Paige, these cases are a cautionary tale of what happens when you have an extreme Republican gerrymander that puts in place a Republican legislature, a supermajority that then decides to enact new voter suppression legislation. So these are cases brought by Voto Latino, which in full disclosure, my law firm represents in this case, the Democratic National Committee and another group called Democracy North Carolina. And these lawsuits challenge a provision that says that if you register same day, okay, so in North Carolina, there is same day registration. If you register to vote same day and cast your ballot during the state's early voting period, that the state will then send out a single mailer to the address you used. And if it comes back as undeliverable, your ballot doesn't count. They don't tell you, they don't notify you, they don't, they just don't count your ballot. And Paige, as Democracy Docket has covered in place after place, these mailers that these non-forwardable mailers, the change of address mailers that the Postal Service sends out, or that states send out that rely on the Postal Service's non-forwardable mailing process, are riddled with errors. I mean, in case after case, we see this come up. The USPS never put this in place as a way for states to use it to disenfranchise voters. And what made this so egregious, this law, is that the voter doesn't get notified that their ballot didn't count. They don't give an opportunity to contest it. They don't get an opportunity to cure it. And so this has been blocked. A federal judge blocked this provision from going into effect. while the case proceeds forward on the merits. So that's the good news. But it just goes to show you, Paige, how extreme Republicans will go to disenfranchise voters. And I encourage everyone, if you have not looked at Democracy Docket's coverage of this issue, there are links in the show notes below.
Speaking of Republican extremism, this last lawsuit in North Carolina is actually from the Democratic governor, Roy Cooper. He's suing the Republican Speaker of the House and President of the Senate over this power grab law, SB 749.
This is nothing more than a Republican power grab, plain and simple. In fact, the Republicans don't even really hide the fact very much because, as I said, of the extreme gerrymandered nature of that legislature. They have a supermajority. And, people may remember there was a trend a few years ago when Democrats took over a number of governorships. You saw Republican legislatures engage in power stripping. And North Carolina was one of those states where they tried to take away from the new incoming Democratic governors all kinds of powers to appoint, powers to control various agencies. And so some of those efforts in North Carolina wound up being struck down because they were targeted at Roy Cooper when he was elected. Well, guess what, Paige? They're back. And they're back with a vengeance. And this time they're targeting democracy. They want to take away Governor Cooper's ability to appoint a Democratic majority or appoint the members of the state boards of elections, and therefore essentially take away the Democrats' ability to have a majority of that board. And guess what, Paige? Who do you think they want to give the power to appoint to? The legislature. They literally want the legislature to have the power to appoint the people that oversee the elections in North Carolina. How convenient is that for a body that is in power in a 50-50 state, has a supermajority? This is just a power grab. It is an anti-democratic effort. If you're not paying attention to what's happening in the courts, you're not paying attention to what's happening in democracy.
I'll add that a state court has blocked and struck down SB 749 as unconstitutional. But of course, Republican lawmakers have appealed that decision. Mark, we talk about all these lawsuits. There are 9 of them. What does it all mean for 2024?
It means that the fight for democracy remains raging in court. People thought that after the experience of 2020, we might see Republicans step back from the brink of election denialism and all that it entailed. And instead, they've doubled down on it. The numbers don't lie. I mean, the RNC is regularly touting how many voter suppression lawsuits they bring. That is, in fact, right now, as far as I can tell, the only thing the RNC actually does is promote the big lie and litigate to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat. And so the stakes for this in North Carolina, like the stakes for this around the country, are enormous because, these small changes that we're talking about, whether or not you can make sure that your ballot counts if you vote during early vote period and same day register, whether or not you can, if you move to the state in the final weeks before the election, whether or not you can vote at all, whether or not we are going to have fair administration of elections. Who's going to run these elections? I assure you, Paige, that if the state legislature of North Carolina gets to say of who they put in charge of the elections, you're going to have election deniers running it, right? And in North Carolina, the state board really is the entity that sets the rules and administers the elections. So, I regularly say democracy is on the docket because if you're not paying attention to the courts, you're not paying attention to democracy, because that's actually true. And there's no state that right now that illustrates that more than North Carolina, which is a presidential battleground state and could decide the fate of who controls the White House, and certainly will decide who controls the governor mansion in the state.
Mark, obviously there's a lot of litigation in North Carolina, but it's very lopsided, right? There are a lot more pro-voting lawsuits than anti-voting lawsuits. And I'm wondering why that is, because in other states like Pennsylvania, for example, there tends to be more of an equal amount of pro and anti-voting lawsuits. But in North Carolina, it's almost all pro-democracy, pro-voting advocacy groups trying to make it easier to vote versus Republican or conservative groups trying to make it harder to vote.
It is extraordinary that in 2024, we are having a conversation about anti-voting lawsuits. I mean, just think about that for a second. There was a time not long ago that when you talked about voting rights lawsuits or election lawsuits, it was automatically assumed that what you were talking about was making it easier to vote, was about taking down barriers aimed at minority voters, at making sure that young voters were fully part of the political process, at celebrating democracy by expanding voting rights. But Paige, as you point out, now that is no longer the case. Right now, we are seeing an absolute tidal wave of voter suppression lawsuits brought by a web of right-wing organizations aimed at making it harder to vote this November. And so in some states, you see more pro-voting lawsuits like we're talking about in North Carolina, because the legislature is controlled by Republicans. And so there has had to be more lawsuits brought to try to strike down the laws that the legislature passes. In other states where you have Democratic governors and Democratic secretaries of state and Democratic attorney general, like in Pennsylvania, like in Arizona, you see the anti-voting forces rallying all of their resources to target those officials, to spread misinformation, disinformation about them, but also to bring litigation to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat. So if there's one thing that everyone watching needs to do, it is to stand up and make sure that you understand your rights, that you know that you are registered, that you have not been purged, that you know that your ballots have counted, that you tell your friends and your families that they need to be registered to vote, and that we all do everything we can in the run-up to this critical election in November to ensure that every eligible voter has an opportunity to vote and have their vote counted. Because if we all do that, we can defeat election denialism. We can defeat the cynicism that the MAGA Republicans want you to buy into. And let's just hope that come November 5th, those forces will prevail. But along the way, Democracy Docket will be there to ensure that you are informed and given good, accurate information. So please subscribe to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. Take advantage of its extremely generous offer right now of a 2-week trial to all of its premium content. And I look forward to talking to you in future videos.